Okay, in this video we're going to talk about a lot of the properties of blood vessels and how blood flows through the circulatory system, and ultimately how the circulatory system accomplishes its job of delivering needed materials to body cells. So I want to talk about the types of blood vessels. I especially want to talk about properties of blood vessels like blood pressure in the types of blood vessels and especially speed. Then I want to talk about how nutrients are carried by different parts of blood in the circulatory system, and with a focus on what happens at capillaries, because I want to argue that capillaries are sort of the functional unit of the circulatory system. That's where the pickup and drop-off actually occurs. So let's go look at this figure as a good way of introducing the circulatory system. There are three broad types of vessels that we might think of. There are arteries over here. Arteries are always going to carry blood away from the heart toward a certain direction. If you've watched my video about the double circuit that blood takes in mammals and birds, you know that there might be arteries heading toward the lungs to pick up oxygen away from the heart, and there are also going to be arteries then heading toward your body cells to drop off all that good stuff. So arteries are always going away from the heart. They are going to branch once they get to that location, wherever they're headed. We could talk about little arteries called arterioles, but I'm not really going to worry about that too much. They branch as well and form a really thin network of many different little tubes called capillaries. Capillaries, again, are where the delivery is going to occur, whether it's picking up oxygen and dropping off CO2 at the lungs. That will happen at a set of capillaries around the lungs, or at body cells dropping off oxygen and picking up carbon dioxide, and some other things as well. So then capillaries will come together once they've done their job of picking up and dropping off. They'll merge back and form. We could talk about little venules that then merge further and become veins, but again, I'm not too worried about venules. Veins are just going to then return blood back to the heart from wherever it's coming from. So here's just kind of a brief summary of all of that. Arteries always carry blood away from the heart. Veins always return blood to the heart. And again, I want to say capillaries are the functional unit because that's where all of the picking up and dropping off of supplies occurs. All right, so let's keep going. Let's talk a little bit about the properties of how blood flows through the body, and thinking about what the pressure might be like in the different types of vessels, and what the speed might be like. So blood pressure is going to be really important for your body to maintain. That's kind of a crucial aspect of homeostasis because pressure is what makes the liquid go around the body. Obviously, you've got a pump in the center of your chest pushing liquid, and when that liquid encounters other liquids, it's going to cause that liquid to push, and then that liquid pushes other liquid. And if there's an adequate pressure around your whole body, then that whole liquid will push on itself and move the whole liquid kind of quickly around the body. And that's why doctors are going to be really concerned about blood pressure as a basic measure of your health. As it turns out, blood pressure is always going to be highest in the areas that are closest to the heart's push. So when the major chambers of your heart push blood out of them, it's arteries that are going to be receiving all of that. So that's why the pressure is going to be highest in the arteries. And then pressure slowly drops as you get further and further away from that push. The liquid's going to meet resistance and sort of other factors that eventually drop the pressure. So it drops in the capillaries, and the pressure becomes very low in the veins because the veins are sort of returning blood to the heart. So you can think of them as being furthest away from the push. Pressure plays a role in how fast the blood travels as well, but as it turns out, blood speed's a little bit more complicated because it's a function of both the pressure that the blood is under as well as how big the space is that the blood is traveling through. So as it turns out, blood travels very fast in the arteries. That might not be too much of a surprise given the high pressure that it's under, but it actually travels slowest in the capillaries, and then it picks up speed again in the veins. And that's despite the pressure being the way that we discussed before. So let me go back to the figure here and let me see if I can justify why blood travels slowest in the capillaries. That's because in this little part of the diagram down here where they talk about cross-sectional area, oh, my pen's going nuts. where they talk about cross-sectional area. They're talking about how as the arteries branch and branch and branch, each individual capillary is going to be very thin and very small, but because there are so many of them, I want you to think about the overall effect being that sort of if we thought of all of the capillaries together, the overall area that the blood is traveling through is tremendously high. So if you could think about merging all the capillaries, it would form something like a garden hose in diameter versus maybe like a garden hose in arteries and veins, very thin. So if I had, say, like a garden hose that had water traveling through it at a certain pressure, and then I could somehow tie that garden hose into a big giant fire hose, the liquid would travel much more slowly through that giant fire hose at the same pressure. So that's why speed really slows down in the capillaries, and it actually picks back up even though the pressure continues to drop in the veins, because when they're merging back together, the overall area decreases again, and so the blood picks up speed. Basically, we're trying to get blood away from the heart or toward the heart in arteries and veins. That's why we want the blood to travel fast in those vessels. And in capillaries, we actually want the travel to be slow because, remember, that's where the delivery is taking place. We're going to see in just a minute that all delivery is essentially carried out by passive transport. Passive transport is great because it's free in terms of energy expense, but a potential problem with passive transport is that it's very slow. Think about the slow diffusion of that acid into the agar cubes that we did. So if it's very slow, then we want to give it as much time as possible for it to occur. That's why we want the capillary blood flow to actually be very slow. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how nutrients are carried then in the blood. I really don't want you to think that blood is just a bunch of cells. It's actually some red blood cells. We're going to talk about white blood cells a little bit more in the immune system later. There's also platelets too that I'm not really going to worry about. I'm going to focus on red blood cells, and I'm going to focus on the water that surrounds all of these cells. Don't forget about the importance of the water flowing through blood, because the water is actually carrying most of the things that we want to deliver to cells. All of the monomers, for the most part, are polar, except for fats. So things like simple sugars, amino acid monomers, nucleotide monomers, other ions, are all capable of being surrounded by water and carried by it. So the only reason we have red blood cells then is that some nutrients like oxygen are non-polar. They don't dissolve very well in water. So we're going to need carrier proteins within the red blood cells. Remember that that's called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein within the red blood cell that can bind weakly to that non-polar oxygen, carry it around. It's kind of important that it binds weakly to the oxygen because then it's willing to let it go once we get to the body cells themselves. So we have carriers for non-polar molecules. I just want to briefly talk about the structure of a red blood cell or erythrocyte itself. Its own shape matches its function. This little diagram here shows that it's kind of concave there. It's kind of folding inward. And I want you to imagine that the other side is also doing the same thing. So we kind of call that a biconcave structure. Why is it neat that it has a biconcave structure? Because that maximizes its surface area and reduces the volume inside. I want you to imagine that if you're a hemoglobin protein, anywhere inside of that cell, you're very close to the surface where you can pick up oxygen in capillaries in the lungs, and you can drop it off very easily at the body cells as well. So a red blood cell's shape matches its function. I believe we also talked briefly before about how a red blood cell at maturity is devoid of organelles and a nucleus. It really has nothing in it except for the proteins that it needs, like hemoglobin. And that also matches its function because we're just trying to make sure that it carries as much oxygen as possible inside of its cell, with as few structures as possible getting in the way of binding to that oxygen. Alright, so let's talk about what red blood cells do when they finally get to your body cells in tiny little capillaries. Capillaries are tiny enough that the red blood cells can only flow by one blood cell at a time. They kind of have to line up. And that's actually very useful as well, because that makes sure that each one of them drops off the oxygen that it's supposed to drop off. All transport that occurs here at capillaries is passive transport. If there is a body cell that's using a lot of monomers to build polymers within it, then the monomers will be higher in concentration in the bloodstream, and they'll just diffuse, probably through facilitated diffusion, because most of those monomers are polar. Something like nonpolar oxygen will just go through simple diffusion, going from high to low concentration. You would imagine that it would be at lower concentration in the body cells because they're using it to do cellular respiration. We'll learn also that capillaries not only drop off nutrients like monomers and oxygen, but they also pick up waste like carbon dioxide produced in respiration. We'll also briefly talk about something called urea. Urea is just sort of a natural waste that cells make doing what they do naturally, and that kind of waste will eventually go to the kidneys to be peed out. Okay, so the last thing I just kind of want to emphasize in this presentation of blood flow is just kind of a neat little discussion in your book about how capillaries can be changed. Your vasculature is not just a static system. It's not just a static set of tubes. Those tubes can kind of change diameter, and you can sort of prioritize sending more blood to a particular area of your body depending on what you're doing. So as it turns out, all capillaries get at least some blood flow. I'm going to come back to this slide in just a second. I just want to show you back in this picture here. So in this picture here, what they call the thoroughfare channel, that's sort of a guaranteed part of the capillary bed that blood will always go through. So every pump of the heart, you're sending blood through all of your arteries that go all the way around your body, and you're always at least sending some blood to every capillary bed. However, you can, if you saw the rest of that capillary bed, we can send much more blood to that whole capillary bed if there are little valves in the capillary bed that open up and allow blood to travel throughout that entire capillary bed. And so what kind of mediates that whole system is just sort of a set of sensory neurons and motor neurons that sort of detect, do you need more oxygen going to that area? And I just want you to appreciate that you can't really open up the capillaries everywhere in your body, otherwise your blood pressure would drop to 0. So just there's this general principle that if you open valves somewhere to send more blood there, you got to close it somewhere else. And your body is capable of kind of doing this naturally without you having to think about it. But just some basic scenarios. What if you're running a race and you're using your leg muscles a lot? Then probably your body is automatically, over time, adjusting to open up the valves in your skeletal muscle in your legs. It's probably going to close capillaries, say, in your stomach, in your digestion. If you're running, you don't want to eat a giant meal right before you go run because you can't do both at the same time. If you're sort of more relaxed, then perhaps you are going to close more capillaries in your skeletal muscle areas, and you're going to open up more blood vessels in your digestive system to digest. So again, all of this happens kind of naturally, and I just want you to appreciate how neat a system it is that your vasculature, your blood vessels, can sort of widen or narrow and open valves and close valves as needed to kind of send blood to where it's needed the most. So what we just tried to go over in this basic video is how your circulatory system really works, what kind of broad types of blood vessels you have, how various properties work like pressure and speed, how nutrients are carried in the blood by various parts, and ultimately how it's delivered.